Greetings to all and welcome back. We appreciate you being here today. Let's get started because we have a brand new story to tell you. Theo is my name. I'm a reserved individual who enjoys alone. Being an author requires me to spend a lot of time alone, which is perfectly acceptable to me. The universe makes sense and I find serenity when I write. Get-togethers? The noise, the small talk, the pretending to be interested in conversations I don't care about, that's not really my thing, and it wears me out. I therefore avoid them whenever possible. However, my marriage was the one thing that used to be more important to me than my job. Take note that I stated used to. Lucy, my wife and I have a long history of marriage, but if I'm being completely honest, we ceased to be a true pair a long time ago. We didn't talk, but we also didn't quarrel, at least not very often. All we did was share a house. The love we once shared vanished somewhere in the distance between us. Unlike me, Lucy is gregarious, driven, and constantly involved. Her consulting job always appeared to require her more than I did, and she works in a fast-paced profession. She was accustomed to working late into the night, attending endless meetings and making longer than necessary business trips. I started by asking questions. Why is it so late? Can't you get done sooner? When are we going to spend time together? However, the response remained consistent. I eventually stopped inquiring. After growing weary of hearing justifications, I came to terms with the fact that she didn't have time for me because she didn't want to make time for me. I immersed myself in my own world, reading, writing, and relishing the isolation that came with my job. That was simpler. Then Lucy mentioned the business party one evening. She insisted that I come, not just invited me. She said that it would benefit me and provide me with a networking opportunity to interact with some of the top professionals in her field. However, I had no desire to shake hands with corporate people or act as though I was interested in their business plans. I had no intention of growing my network. I did, however, pause at the way she pushed it. She was essentially requesting it, not only implying it. Perhaps this was her attempt to make things right, to entice me into her world, as I had always requested. There was a part of me that clung to the idea that our marriage may yet be saved. I finally gave in after some back and forth. I promised to go. Although I wasn't very excited about it, I had to take advantage of the remote possibility that this could be a move in the right direction for our relationship. I was prepared to put up with a couple hours of phony grins and courteous banter. I didn't realize then that accepting that party would be the first step to the end of it all. We looked like the ideal pair when we got to the location. Lucy had gone all out. She was dressed in a sophisticated, form-fitting gown that turned heads as soon as we entered. Even though I couldn't have cared less about leaving an impression, I had made the effort to put on a fitted suit. The party itself was elegant, sophisticated, and packed with well-dressed professionals, everything you would anticipate from a high-profile business gathering. It was the sort of gathering where, in between sips of expensive wine, people talked about stocks, mergers, and business strategy. Lucy introduced me to her co-workers right away, and they all responded in essentially the same way, politely asking, "So you're Theo? We have heard a great deal about you. It's wonderful to finally meet you face to face." I would shake hands, nod, and say a few niceties. I was the enigmatic husband they had only vaguely heard about, the man who never attended work parties, so it was clear that I was a bit of a novelty. Some of them made an effort to learn more by inquiring about my books, work, and opinions on any subject they felt I may find interesting. I was surprisingly more involved than I had anticipated. Perhaps there is some value in this evening. It had been an unexpectedly good evening. I wouldn't say I was having fun, but I had become accustomed to the environment. The drinks were good, The talks were bearable, and Lucy seemed to appreciate my presence in her life for the first time in a long time. For a little time, I let myself imagine that perhaps, just possibly, this was a start in the right direction. Even if I wasn't stupid enough to think that this night would miraculously mend the rifts in our marriage. It was everything going smoothly. I could see Lucy occasionally looking at me, perhaps appreciating that I was trying. Until the music changed, couples began to arrive on the dance floor as the lights gradually went down. Before I realized a man was coming at us, I wasn't really paying attention. Instead of acknowledging me, he approached Lucy directly. He held out his hand as if he already knew the answer and said, "Shall we?" in a smooth, confident voice. I waited for a moment for Lucy to shake her head, perhaps to laugh it off and remain in her current position. I thought she would tell him she was here with her husband and wave him away. Instead, though, she grinned. She was on the verge of agreeing. It was instinct. Before she could move, I grabbed her wrist firmly and held her back. I spoke in a quiet, controlled tone. "You won't be leaving." At last the man, Wilson, I would find out, acknowledged me. He didn't say anything at first, but he tilted his head slightly to look at me. "I didn't back down. Do things correctly if you want to dance with my wife. Or don't even do them. It ought to have ended there." However, it wasn't. Lucy turned to face me, her face contorted with fury and frustration. She jerked her arm away from me and said, "What the hell is wrong with you? You're making me look foolish." Startled by what she had just done, I turned to face her. She then brushed past me as if I were merely a roadblock in her way and turned back to Wilson. He was going to take her away, directly before me, without feeling guilty. Without hesitation, something inside of me snapped. "I will have to dissolve this marriage if you even move an inch." Wilson didn't respond till then. He looked me in the eyes as he fully turned to face me. "And you've always been a weakling," he remarked in a low, thoughtful voice. "You won't take any action." Then, without averting his gaze, he grabbed Lucy's hand and dragged her along, and suddenly she was following. Even though I could feel the shame bearing down on me, I resisted giving them the satisfaction of a response. Wouldn't be the idiot that sparked a fight at a gathering with her co-workers. Rather, I turned around and left by myself. I was still up that night when Lucy eventually got home. I could hear her shoes clicking across the hardwood floor as the front door opened. That night I had already decided on a lot of things, but I couldn't go asleep. After a few minutes, she crossed her arms and stood in the doorway. I anticipated that she would provide a feeble justification for her behavior at the party, perhaps even a straightforward one. Rather, she went right into a furious outburst. I listened to her without interjecting. "You made me feel ashamed," she said sternly, her eyes blazing with bitterness. "You just left after making a scene without any justification. At my own work party, you left me." I listened to every word while standing there in silence. In her mind, I was the one who had ruined everything, and she was the victim. As I listened, it became very evident that I was no longer regarded by Lucy. Not as a guy, and definitely not as her spouse. A marriage that lacks mutual respect is doomed to fail, much like a house built on shaky foundations. I knew there would be no use in arguing with her now. No amount of discussion would convince her otherwise. She had already made up her mind that she was correct. Rather, her stern words just reinforced my long-held suspicions. Our fate had been sealed by Lucy's deeds and her refusal to accept responsibility. However, Wilson was another issue I had to deal with before I could really address the problems in our relationship. I was not the kind of man who looked for trouble. However, I also made sure that major boundary violations were not ignored. Wilson had gone too far when he so brazenly confronted Lucy during the party, obviously thinking I was too helpless to intervene. His first, and most important, error was his overconfidence. At that moment, I made the decision to not let anyone treat me disrespectfully and to take the required action to make Wilson answerable for his deeds. Lucy hardly recognized my presence the following morning. No small talk, no greetings, just a chilly, meaningless quiet. She was obviously still punishing me for the party since she walked around the house as like I didn't exist, slamming drawers a little harder than normal and letting out a loud sigh. I didn't respond. Whatever perverse game she was playing, I had already left. My thoughts were elsewhere. I took action by noon. I engaged a private detective. My directives were straightforward. I wanted Wilson to do everything, each and every filthy little secret, all the bones in his closet, who he spoke to, where he stayed at night, and where he resided. I wanted to hold on to whatever was there to find. There were no inquiries posed by the investigator. He simply gave a nod and went to work. Days went by, and Lucy kept treating him in silence. I didn't care, though. I hardly paid attention. I was awaiting the outcome, and they arrived a few weeks later. Wilson had a spouse, 2 children, a wife who appeared blissfully oblivious to the filth she was married to based on the pictures. However, it wasn't all. Wilson was known for something. Records showed that women at his place of employment had complained about unwanted advances, some dismissed, while others quietly settled. A pattern of conduct concealed by corporate apathy and paperwork. The actual dagger, though? The proof of his affairs. One picture after another, video after video. His long history of inappropriate behavior at work and his extracurricular activities are all documented, different places, different ladies, and my wife, Lucy, is one of them. There were time stamps on the pictures and videos. He encountered these women in a variety of settings, including lounges, hotels, and even a few secret parking lots late at night. I was devastated to learn that my wife had dated him, but I chose not to let it get to me. I had a suspicion. I had evidence now. Wilson was done, even though he wasn't aware of it yet. It had to be a personal blow. His wife has a right to know her spouse. I assembled the box, which included a USB flash drive filled with pictures and videos of Wilson in inappropriate locations for a married man. He had been irresponsible, and I could prove it with the receipts. I wrote a handwritten note next to it that read, "You deserve better." She received it right at her door. After hiring a delivery man to bring it, I waited a few days for the fire to grow throughout their house and for her to come to terms with the treachery. Perhaps she went up to him. Perhaps she gathered her belongings and departed. I didn't really care, but there was no way to know. They had to fight the battle, however. I wasn't done yet. Wilson's job was the next thing he needed to lose in addition to his wife. I began emailing the human resources department of his business, claims from anonymous sources that describe his history of sexual harassment at work, his habit of having affairs with colleagues, and how he exploited his position to coerce women into keeping quiet. No business responds to a single complaint, therefore one email wouldn't be sufficient. I, therefore, made it appear larger. I made several email accounts, each with a different version of the information, and each one sounding like a worried worker fed up with the poisonous atmosphere Wilson fostered. The pressure was effective. The business was forced to look into it. The rumors evolved into formal gatherings. Wilson was being observed, interrogated, and examined. After a month, the decision was made. He was let go. Lucy, too. She also didn't get away with it. Lucy, too. She also didn't get away with it. She and the other women involved in the office relationships were suspended by the corporation. Perhaps they were still debating how to handle them. Perhaps they were cautioning them to reconsider their decisions. In any case, the harm was done. Lucy appeared exhausted as she entered the room on the day Wilson was fired. I understood why already. Wilson was no longer employed. She was on suspension. Every detail, including the emails, the inquiry, and the ultimate conclusion, had been provided to me by my inside contacts. Even though she hadn't spoken to me about it, I could tell by the look on her face. I remained sitting and observed her from the other side of the room.
"Hard day?" I asked in a composed tone. She looked at me wearily and scoffed. "You don't know." I leaned a little forward. "I may have a thought. Is Wilson no longer there? You're also suspended?" After a brief moment of stiffness, she faked a giggle.
She shook her head and walked toward the kitchen, acting as though she hadn't just heard me say, "Oh God, here we go again." I prevented her from getting away. "Lucy, how long did you sleep with him?" That brought her to a halt. She turned around and laughed once more, but with a hint of nervousness this time. "Are you still on this, really?" "You're so obsessed, Theo. Since the party, you have been insecure and resentful." I simply gazed at her. She folded her arms. "All I did was dance with the man, and you turned it into this whole fantasy in your head." She looked at me pathetically, as if I were some phony paranoid idiot. "You overreacted that night. And now look at you, acting like some detective in a bad crime show." I refrained from arguing. I didn't shout. I simply took the folder out of my drawer and placed it on the table before her. "Pictures." Lucy's face lost its colour. She was speechless for the first time. Then the switch, the voice trembling, the tears. "Why would you do this, Theo?" She drew closer, her tone brimming with desperation, her eyes glistening. "You destroyed my life and my career. Was that your intention? To ruin me?" I gave in to her tirade. I allowed her to accuse me of revealing her and unearthing what she believed to be securely concealed. I stated quite bluntly, "The divorce papers will be ready soon. If you have a problem with that, take it to court." She was standing there by alone, drowning in the ruins of her own decisions, when I turned and left. Having stated that, I would like to share some lessons I learned from my experience with you. These are the facts I learned from this incident, and some of you may agree with me or not. First, betrayal begins with disdain. Our marriage was over the minute Lucy followed Wilson onto that dance floor. The dance wasn't the main focus. A wife who respects her husband would not think twice about shutting down another man, especially not in front of her husband. That was the significance of that moment. It told me everything that she even thought about it, much less went through with it. I had to know. Second, trust individuals when they show you who they are. Long before that night, Lucy had been acting aloof. It wasn't a coincidence that she would frequently appear too busy for us, stay up late, or make excuses. They were indicators. I disregarded the signs because I wanted to think that everything was still possible. In actuality, though, if someone repeatedly tells you that you are not important, it's because you aren't. I ought to have embraced it sooner. At least I didn't flee from the reality when it eventually came. Third, it's preferable to take revenge cold. I was embarrassed at the gathering that evening. I was helpless. For a moment, I thought Wilson was telling the truth when he called me a weakling. However, emotions may lead to carelessness, and I wasn't going to let my rage to drive me to act recklessly. I waited, I collected data, I made sure that every action I took would be significant, and ultimately patience transformed that one humiliating moment into complete ruin. Wilson was laid off. Most likely his marriage is in shambles. Lucy too? Well, she received just what she was due. Lastly, it is never a waste of time to put things right. Some may argue that I should have simply left this alone because I expended too much energy on it. They might be correct. But regaining your authority isn't simply required when someone shows you they don't care about you by blatantly disrespecting you. It is the sole option. The man who allowed himself to be walked over is not one I want to be. And I have no regrets about it at all. I'll let you do it now. What are your thoughts? Should I have handled it differently, or was my behavior appropriate? Tell me.